Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Historical Lethbridge, a public conference. This conference is sponsored by the University of Lethbridge in conjunction with the Public Library and CATV Channel 12. When we were thinking about the centennial of Lethbridge a year or two ago, we at the university thought that it would be a good time to have a historical conference, but not one geared to academics, one geared to the general public, and that basically is what this conference is about. Normally, perhaps I should explain that we have at the, sponsored by the university, a thing called the History Association of Lethbridge. And we have monthly meetings, but normally we don't deal with local history because there is in the city, as most of you know, the local chapter of the Alberta Historical Association, the Hoopa chapter, which does local history. But this seemed to us to be a very special occasion, the 100th anniversary of Lethbridge, and so we thought it appropriate to co-sponsor a conference. So we're delighted to welcome you here. Our speaker tonight, whom I'll introduce a little more in a few minutes, is Professor Andy den Otter, who will be speaking to us at the sort of the earliest time period of Lethbridge history, 100 years ago. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, Alex Johnson will be speaking to us on some of the themes in the development of Lethbridge history. And on Saturday morning, the students at the university in the Lethbridge Regional History course will be showing some slides, some of the photographic materials that are available on Lethbridge. And really a Saturday is more of a participation, both in the morning and in the afternoon session, where we've got what looks like a very interesting panel to discuss some of the themes in the history of Lethbridge, more of the arts and the society and culture of the city. So a few points of business, really, I suppose. One is that if you would like to get a copy of the outline of the conference, we have some of these here. If you would like to join the History Association, which means that you would get the mail-outs of the History Association of Lethbridge, would you sign your name on this? There's also a few sheets indicating our next talk at the History Association in March, and it's Canadian Psychiatry in the Great War, where Dr. Tom Brown will be looking at the impact of shell shock on the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And I should bring your attention as well to the fact that, being centennial year, our two main speakers at this conference, Professor den Otter and Dr. Alex Johnson, have co-authored a centennial history. It is possible to order copies of that now, and that's what's indicated on this sheet. There are some special commemorative editions of the centennial history by Andy and Alex, and you can get information about that from this. It certainly would be a good opportunity to order your copy. And then one of the final points of business I want to bring to your attention is that on April the 20th, there will be a meeting of the Historical Society of Alberta in Lethbridge at the exhibition grounds. And at that time, there will be the formal opening, the launching of the book by Andy and Alex. And incidentally, Andy will be the guest speaker in the evening. And there's information on that program on this sheet. Now, if you've followed all of that, I'm sure you're a lot better than I am, but at the break or at the end of the evening, you can come and take a look at this material. Now, what we're here for tonight in particular is to hear Professor Andy Otter. Andy originally comes from Holland, and he did most of his academic work at the University of Alberta. He teaches presently at Memorial University in Newfoundland, but is one of the very few academics teaching in a university institution that has done work on Lethbridge. He published 2 years ago this book, Civilizing the West, the Galts and the Development of Western Canada, which really deals with the history of Lethbridge from the beginnings to 1906. And as I've previously mentioned, he is the co-author with Alex Johnson of the Centennial History. Now, Andy is going to begin at the beginning. He's going to tell us something about some of the key figures in the establishment of Lethbridge, in particular the Galts. Andy, welcome. It's all yours.
Well, I just wonder if I could ask you in your imagination to go back exactly 100 years ago to the 28th of February, 1885. If you were living at that time, you might be considering buying, say, a 10-room mansion in downtown Toronto for $4,200. Or you might want that piece of fine cotton at 5 cents a yard. Or perhaps you're considering a nice, good quality tweed suit at $11. Or perhaps the cheaper wool one for $7.50. But in case you get sort of carried away with these low prices, I might remind you that a teacher in 1885 would be earning about $250 a year. And I sort of hope there are no school board members at this meeting today. On the other hand, you might be getting terribly upset with reckless government spending. It seems that government expenditures are once again getting out of hand. The original estimates by the Canadian government for spending 1885 is about $29.8 million for the entire year. And now, just that very day, the 28th of February, they've come out with the new budget, and they're going to spend $31,757,632. What are we coming to? Government expenditures rising year by year. When and where will it finally stop? On the one hand, 1885 is a kind of an exciting year. 1885 is the year that Pasteur will develop the sterilization of milk. The motorcycle will be introduced, but then so will the first naval submarine. It's also the year of the first long-distance telephone call, Boston to New York. And in Toronto, if you phone or dial 1-8, you will get J.R. Bailey and Company, who is quite prepared to deliver to you a load of finest anthracite from Pennsylvania. On the 28th of February, 1885, which was a Saturday, the Ramsey Rink of Brantford played to a full house in Toronto and beat the Rennie's Rink for the Moat Cup in curling. More astonishing is J.G. Ross, who snowshoed 2 miles in 11 minutes and 54 seconds. I think a lot of people would have difficulty doing that kind of a distance in 11 seconds in running shoes on nice dry pavement. It's also, 1885 is also a kind of a disturbing year. The Russians are encroaching on Afghanistan, and Britain threatens to retaliate. In fact, there are severe repercussions in the House of Commons in England. The Gladstone government is under severe attack because just Less than a month earlier, General Charles Gordon was surrounded at Khartoum and killed. The French are fighting the Chinese in the Tonkin, and the Italians are battling somebody else at the Red Sea. But what about in Western Canada on February the 28th, 1885? Well, at a little place on a CPR main line, just east of Medicine Hat, at a little place called Dunmore, there's a crew at work, 25 men. They're building a siding, a roundhouse, car shop, coal transferring facilities, and a rooming house. Earlier that day, on the 28th, a CPR train has come by and has unloaded several carloads of surplus railway ties not needed by the CPR, adding to the enormous pile of 70,000 ties already piled up there, and eventually will become about 75,000. Should you be bold enough to ask the crew what they are doing, they will tell you that they are preparing for the construction of a narrow gauge railway for the Alberta Railway and Coal Company, a company or a railway which will service the coal mines of the Northwestern Coal and Navigation Company at Coalbanks, about 110 miles to the west. If you hang around long enough and become friendly with the crew, they will probably invite you down for an evening's entertainment. After all, this is Saturday, the last Saturday of the month, therefore it's payday. And with their pockets full of money, they'll probably take a speeder westward down the line to Medicine Hat, where it will be warm, where there will be plenty of drinks and plenty of women. And so these men are looking forward to an evening of riotous living in Medicine Hat and a good weekend, and perhaps they'll stumble back on Monday to get back to Dunmore. That Saturday, the 28th, then, 1885, things are probably not as great at Coalbanks. The small crew working there just don't have the same kind of prospects for a weekend of fun as do the crews at Dunmore. By February at Coalbanks, Montague Aldous has just laid out the town site. And so on the snow-covered town site, and it has been a very cold, snowy winter, you probably would see some of the spikes or the markings, the survey stakes, which mark the very wide and broad streets that Aldous has laid out. And Aldous, probably enchanted by the open and expansive prairies, has laid out nice wide streets. And opposite what I suppose is going to be the station, he has made a big square. So that, I think in his imagination, when people come out of the railway station, immediately they will be greeted by a park surrounded by prosperous businessmen. In fact, there are already a few businessmen on the site. They've pitched tents in open anticipation then of the great sales and the good lots which they can choose once sales of land begin. There's a small crew working on a boarding house and a few cottages in anticipation of the opening of the railway and of the mines. Below, on the river bottom lands, 2 residences belonging to the mine managers are already there, surrounded by all manners of shanties and little sheds. There's a drift into the hillside, and occasionally on that Saturday you'll see an occasional car coming out of the mine. You can see that coal production, is still very, very little. And if you wander down the railway track to the pier, you could see why. The river is frozen. The few barges along the side are covered by snow. And you recognize that Coalbanks is entirely isolated. There is no way to get the coal production out of the mine and to sell it in large markets. In your imagination on that February the 28th, 1885, you should cast your mind about several hundred miles to the northeast, to the tiny town of Saint Laurent, where Louis Riel is sitting that evening alone in a back room of a small house, planning a speech, perhaps one of the most crucial speeches that he will make. He's going to make it tomorrow, right after Mass. A few days earlier, he has spoken to a gathering of Métis, and there he has argued that he has fulfilled his mission. He has prepared the petition they wanted, and he has sent it off to Ottawa. And now he wants to go back to the United States, back to his teaching job in Montana. But a rowdy crowd has cheered him on and clamored for him to stay. And so now, that Saturday night, the 28th of February, there is Riel planning to speak. He's planning to tell the Métis that following day he has tried everything. There's only one recourse: violence and a provisional government. The Métis then, if they want their rights guaranteed against the white society that is coming, will have to stand up for these rights. And so tomorrow he plans to rouse the Métis, prepare them to set up a provisional government. This had worked in 1869, and he's confident that it will work again tomorrow. Again, if you can take your mind and on that February the 28th, that Saturday evening, and now go hundreds of miles to the east, in Winnipeg. And there an Elliot Gault is sitting down to dinner with his half-brother, John Galt, a local wholesaler who, with Hugh MacDonald, the son of the Prime Minister, have established a very prosperous wholesaling firm in Winnipeg. Galt has just been in the United States, and there he has purchased several locomotives for the Alberta Railway and Coal Company, for Elliot Gould is the manager of the Alberta Railway and Coal Company. At this time, he's 35 years old, a bachelor, tall, well over 6 feet, athletic, and very handsome. Once in a Montana saloon, the athletic Galt had walked into the rough and tumble and the noisy saloon and challenged the local boys to a game of billiards. The cowboys, thinking this eastern dude would know next to nothing, agreed, whereupon Elliot Gault immediately cleared the table, took their money, and walked out. It seems an unlikely thing for Elliot Gault to do, because he's very shy and very reserved. I suspect that the two Gaults on that day were discussing the coal banks mining operation, the railway, and gradually maybe their talk turned to their common father, Sir Alexander Gault, now resident in Montreal, a man who has arranged the financing for the Alberta Railway and Coal Company, and only weeks ago has managed to get a very handsome government subsidy for the construction of this venture. So I would invite you to come with me and look at Alexander Gault and then at Elliot Gault. Let's look at their views, their ambitions. Maybe it will teach us something about Lethbridge, the city they founded. And I hope one thing that will emerge is that there were many, many obstacles in the way of the founding of Lethbridge. And that even on that evening of the 28th of February, 1885, it is still highly unlikely that Lethbridge will ever be founded. And so we'll look then at the career of the two Gaults. Well, Sir Alexander Tillich Gault is the son of John Galt, a restless Scottish entrepreneur, poet, author, colonizer, city builder, you name it, John Galt has done it. He has helped to found the Canada Land Company, a large land-owning firm close to Lake Huron. In 1826, Galt has moved to Canada and becomes the founder of Guelph, of Galt, and of Goodrich. And so the founding of cities is well established in the family of the Gaults. But Galt is not a man to spend or pay much attention to the spending of money. In fact, he loves to spend money. He spends too much on advertising, too much on improvement, too much on luring settlers to the land. And then when he begins to quarrel with local government officials, he's really fired. They don't quite do it in that crude of fashion, but I guess he's dismissed. He's recalled to come back to London. And so in 1828, Galt returns home and immediately finds himself in debtor prison. He's obviously overspent himself. This bankruptcy of Galt, of John Galt then, will leave a lasting mark on that of his son, Alexander. Alexander Galt then is the youngest of 3 sons, born on the 6th of September, 1817 in London. In 1835, he becomes the junior clerk of another large land company, the British American Company, which has large land holdings in what is today Quebec. The company does very poorly. The land just won't sell. And when the company asks Alexander what he thinks they should do about the large debts that these landowners and the farmers are accumulating, Galt does not suggest foreclosure. Instead, he asks the company to extend the credit terms, make them easier. But he does something which is much more novel and which will eventually be used right here in southern Alberta. He suggests that the farmers be allowed to supply labor instead of cash. In other words, they should be allowed to work on company projects and thereby pay off their debts. Now, these suggestions work very well. So well, in fact, that in 1842, the company invites Alexander Galt to come to London and talk about the company's fortunes. And here Alexander Galt suggests a more vigorous recruiting campaign, just like his dad had done. He suggests giving bonuses to manufacturers so that they'll come into the cities and set up factories. The company does this and flourishes. Land sales begin to pick up and the company prospers. So that in 1844, when Alexander Galt is 27 years old, he's made the chief commissioner of the company. He's given total free hand to do as he pleases, and he only has to account year by year to the headquarters back in London. Now, one part of Galt's great success is that he becomes involved in the building of a railway which will go from the Atlantic Ocean in Maine, Portland, Maine, to Montreal. And it gives Montreal a year-round access to the ocean. But one of the nice things about this railway, it goes right through his company's lands. And so it means immediately these lands raise in value. But from this experience, Galt learns a number of lessons, and it also has a number of results that I'd just like to look at because it'll affect very much his career subsequently, and it'll also affect the development here in southern Alberta. The construction of this railway is a very dramatic story, and I just don't have the time here to explain it all, but it's one of close to bankruptcy. The venture is almost always called off, but every time Galt manages to scrape a few dollars here and a few dollars there, and construction proceeds. But the result of the railway is that in 1849, the Canadian government, for the first time, subsidizes a railway. And this is done at the request of Galt, and the Galt Railway then is the first railway to benefit from this new policy. And of course that will become part of the story of the Galts here in Lethbridge in the 1880s. The other thing that happens because of this railway and of the success is that Galt becomes very well known in Montreal as sort of well, not quite a hero, but certainly someone who has done an admirable thing. All the other businessmen are quite proud of what Galt has done. The other thing that it does, it makes him rich. He makes a lot of money from this railway, which he then uses in other railway ventures in the Canadas. So that by the mid-1850s, he's a very wealthy man. And now he decides to go into politics, because that's one thing he's learned too from building the railway. You can do better being a politician than asking politicians for favors. If you want something done, it's a lot of trouble to go knocking on politicians' doors. You're much better off sitting in the politician's office. And so he enters politics and is elected then for Sherbrooke in what is now Quebec. His company complains. You're spending too much time on politicking rather than looking after the affairs of the company. Well, this is what Galt replies, and this is quoted then from his letter. And I quote then, I will frankly admit to the court that if instructed to confine myself to the sale of land and collection of debt, I cannot adequately give value for my salary, and that it is only by striving to remove the weighty evils that press on the country that the company itself can prosper. What Galt is saying, I consider the interests of the company and the country to be identical. Aside from his very successful political career, his very successful business career, socially too, Alexander Galt begins to climb. And one way he does it is through marriage. And so in 1848, he marries Elliot Torrance, the daughter of a wealthy banker and shipping magnate in Montreal. In 1850, unfortunately, Elliot Gould dies, bearing then her first son, and Alexander calls him, after his mother, Elliot Torrance. In 1851, Alexander Galt remarries. He's now 34. He marries Elliot's younger sister, Amy, who is 18. This marriage has to be performed in the United States, because in Canada it was illegal to marry the sister of one's deceased wife. And so they both go to New York and are married there. It's a very happy and long marriage. Now, although Alexander Gould is seldom at home, they still manage to have 12 children, 8 daughters, 4 sons, 2 of whom will die in infancy. And so in all then, Alexander Galt, will have had 13 children. Well, what kind of man is Alexander Galt? Someone with an incisive mind, an incredible ability to grasp something very difficult and complex, reduce it into fairly simple terms, and then explain it to others. And that's why he becomes so successful in his railway career and as a politician. But he's also extremely egotistical, a man with an extremely fiery temper, easily roused, very abrasive kind of a personality. And along with that comes a certain sense of optimism, that nothing is too big. Anything can be tackled, and anyone then who stands in his way must be brusquely pushed aside. He is, I think I once called him, a practical visionary, someone who has visions, but who can make those visions and dreams into reality. Well, the political career of Galt just sort of climbs and climbs. By, say, 1858, he is now the leader of the English-speaking Canadians in what is today Quebec. And in 58, July 58, he makes a very interesting speech in what would then be the House of Commons, or the Legislative Assembly. He suggests that all the provinces of British North America should be united. That's the Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and the 2 Canadas. He then suggests that once this confederation is complete, the new nation should annex Rupert's Land, which is of course today Western Canada. And it should then build a railway from central Canada, the new Canada, to the Western Canada. In other words, Galt, 27 years before our date, 1885, realizes that there is a tremendous economic potential in Western Canada. People should realize, he says, and I quote again, such a thing has never yet occurred to any one people, as to have the offer of half a continent to be handed over to the control of the legislature. The wealth of the Northwest could transform the small provinces into a powerful nation. But Canada must act quickly to open the doors for the young men of Canada to go into that country. Otherwise, the Americans would certainly go there first. Half a continent is ours if we do not keep on quarreling about petty matters and lose sight of what interests us most. If Canadians want to prosper, they must adopt a firm national policy, a comprehensive program which will transform several insignificant provinces into a mighty nation, spanning an entire continent. Galt then in 1858 recognizes or advocates that Canada be united so that it can exploit or economically develop what is now Western Canada. Within days of this speech, Alexander Gault will be named the Minister of Finance. And as such, he begins by heightening the tariffs in order to protect the local manufacturers. And then within, well, a matter of 10 years, he becomes one of the prominent fathers of Confederation. And then in 1879, he becomes the first High Commissioner in London. His job? To encourage emigration to Western Canada. And it is while he's in London that he hears from his son Elliot that there is coal to be found in Western Canada, and that perhaps he and his father should do something about that. And so we'll look then again at Elliot Gould, who, as I said before, was born in 1849, groomed by his dad for a business career. Bishop's College in Sherbrooke, Quebec, Harrow, England, and once that's finished, a tour of Europe, which was the common thing. Well, Galt then is a graceful, athletic, scholarly, quiet, shy individual, very polite, meticulous attention to the tiniest little details, patient, the exact opposite of his father. And he's tightly controlled by his father. When Elliot Gault is 22 years old, he receives a bequest, but his father forbids him then to accept it. Instead, Alexander takes care of the bequest. Why? Alexander is afraid that his 22-year-old son will be corrupted by all this money. My constant prayer to God is that you may be preserved from the great danger of acquiring the habit of considering only your monetary enjoyment. The dealing with this money will distract your attention from what is now to you of more importance, a strict attention to your office duties. In 1879, when Galt is 29, Alexander Gault writes the Prime Minister of Canada that his son is leading a life of self-indulgence, great temptation. And could the Prime Minister perhaps take care of this and find a job for Elliot somewhere far away from that wicked Ottawa and Montreal? Prime Minister MacDonald will comply, and perhaps in even a way that Alexander Gault hadn't expected. He names him the secretary to the Indian Commissioner, which means that Elliot Gault will now have to go to Western Canada, far removed then from the life of self-indulgence. And so perhaps you might just think with me that the act of a overprotective father for the concern with the self-indulgent life of his son will in a way lead to the founding of this city. I'm not sure if Elliot Gault and John Galt discussed the life of self-indulgence and the misbehavior that Elliot Gault was subject to at that very tender age of 29. It's too bad, because I'm kind of curious what so upset Alexander Gault. Because after all, this is a very upright, church-going fellow. And what could he possibly have done wrong? It has to be a very church-going age, because of on the February the 28th, you read the Toronto Globe, the Saturday edition, you'll get a 2-page coverage of a sermon by the greatest theologian of that time, theologian Spurgeon. And I presume that if a newspaper devoted that much space to a sermon, that everyone would read it. It's a prim and proper kind of age. Elliot Gault in 1885 will complain to his mother that it's so difficult to find good servants in Lethbridge who will launder for him and fix him his meals. It's also an age which will concern itself with etiquette. The subject of napkins or serviettes devotes or takes up a lot of time. Again, the Globe, the Toronto Globe will inform its readers, for example, that the law of the napkin is but vaguely understood. And you may not realize that in 1885, it was improper to spread your napkin over both your knees. Instead, one would have to lay it very carefully over the right knee, and only occasionally daub it to one's lips as one soiled it with food. And what must one do with one's napkin after dinner? Do you crumple it? Throw it away on your chair? Definitely not. One must fold the fabric with unostentatious care. That means you got to do it so nobody sees it. Lay it on the left of the plate, far from the liquids and liqueurs and coffee, and thus testify to the hostess that her care in preparing the table has been appreciated. And so I presume that Elliot and John Galt, after they had finished their dinner, observed this bit of etiquette and ostentatiously or unostentatiously folded their fabric and laid it far to the left of their plates. They then probably retired to the library for a bit of brandy and a cigar. And undoubtedly then, Elliot Gould discussed the trip that he was about to make that Tuesday. He planned to leave by the CPR, which now was on its winter schedule. Once a week, the CPR left Winnipeg to Medicine Hat. 8:30 in the morning, the crack of dawn. He would arrive in Medicine Hat more than a day later at midnight. It will even have a sleeping car. And so that is much different than the kind of traveling that Elliot Gould was doing, say, about 6 years earlier. Because in September of 1879, Elliot Gould traveled for the first time to Western Canada, except this time it was on horseback, accompanied by some wagons and carts. We know he left Red River, spent some time at the Cypress Hills, and then made several circuitous routes through Western Canada. Early in September of 1879, he arrives once again at the Cypress Hills, stays there for a day, and then heads straight west to Fort Macleod, a journey that will take him 4.5 days. We know that then, almost certainly, that in September then he must have crossed the Belly River. And I would suspect at Coalbanks, where he would use the services of Sheeran's ferry. Undoubtedly, he saw the coal outcroppings on the banks, and tradition had it that he took a bit of this coal back with him to eastern Canada, and that eventually then it was assayed and found to be valuable. We know that Elliot Gault made a second trip in 1880. This time he comes from the United States, going through Fort Benton. And he tells us that he took a stagecoach close to Fort Benton, which was extremely crowded. It was full, probably about 6 passengers inside, and then 4 big bruisers crawled to the top and sat on top of the roof. And then at the next stop, 2 more guys got on, and they came inside the carriage and sat on Elliot's lap for 5 hours. And one can just imagine bouncing over the road, the prairie roads, with 2 people on your knees or on your lap. On top of all that, the roof was beginning to cave in. And so the passengers inside had to hold the roof up with their hands. We know then again that in 1880, Elliot Gould visited Coalbanks. But there has been no progress on the development of the mines because there's no way of getting the coal to any kind of market, if there is any market at all. There is, Alexander Galt is in London, and he's managed to get some interested people, but they're not going to put down their money until there is a way of getting the coal to market, and I suppose until there is a market. Well, the spring of 1881 is really the decisive year for the city of Lethbridge, because in the spring of 1881, the directors of the CPR decide that the railway must go south through Medicine Hat and Calgary rather than through Saskatoon and Edmonton. It's at this point that the coal banks or the coal deposits that Elliot Gault has seen on the banks of the Belly River become economically feasible. And so in the summer of 1881, Alexander Gault hires Captain Nicholas Bryant, a mining engineer from Nova Scotia, who is asked then to travel to southern Alberta to see if coal mining there is feasible. And once Bryant reports back and says it is, Alexander Gault then gets a message from Elliot, and he now goes to his backers. The first, and perhaps the wealthiest, is William H. Smith, the same family then which still today owns the big publishing companies sort of known around the Western world. He's then a newsagent and a bookseller. Sort of behind William H. Smith, his financial advisor and secretary, is William Lethbridge, an associate and a close friend. We will discover that William Lethbridge is the most cautious of the investors. And perhaps it's a bit of an irony that Lethbridge fought the whole issue all the way through, because he thought the whole idea of starting a coal mine in Western Canada 100 miles away from the nearest railway was a stupid and silly idea. And so he certainly constantly advised William Smith not to do this. The other individual involved is another William Asmead Bartlett Burdette Coutts, an American residing in England who had married a wealthy heiress, Burdette Coutts, Angela Burdette Coutts. And then added to this company are a number of prominent Canadians. And so on the 25th of April, 1882, the Northwestern Coal and Navigation Company is incorporated. It asks the government for several coal sites, and the government is keen. It wants to develop these coal mines really badly, and so it gives the company 21-year leases for 25 cents an acre, and all they have to pay is 10 cents royalty per ton of coal. Lethbridge will do, as he's the official, I suppose, agent of the company, he will take out 4 leases. 2 at Coal Banks, 1 at Blackfoot Crossing, 1 at Woodpecker, and then Galt will take 1 lease at Grassy Lake. Then on May of 1882, Galt will hire Bryant to survey all of these spots and then to determine which ones should be developed first. And so once again, it's not at all certain that Coal Banks is going to be the first. In fact, the favorite spot is the one at Blackfoot Crossing, close to Gleason. Here, Alexander Gault hopes to set up a land company as well as a coal mine. And so in the summer of 1882, Alexander Gault will take a leave of absence from his high commissionership to go to Western Canada and help make that very crucial decision, which of the coal mines will be developed first. Alexander Gault is terribly unhappy in London. He's sort of going broke, and the Canadian government is too cheap to pay him a good salary, at least in Galt's estimation. He just can't spend any money on parties. And how can you be an ambassador in a foreign country without having good parties? Not only that, he has these 8 daughters to support, and they know they're not bringing him any income. And so poor Alexander Gault can't look after his business interests in Canada. And so he writes MacDonald, "I want to go to the Northwest Country this summer, and my land interest in Montreal demand that I should be there. All my own matters seem to go to the bad when I'm away, which is a good reason for going back. I've been in office for 2 years, and I cannot truly say that I've had a happy time." And so Galt then will cross the Atlantic, spend some time in Montreal, and then start on a very slow and arduous journey across the Canadian prairies. He gets to go a little bit by railway to Assiniboine, and then he has to go 700 miles by buckboard. Remember now that Galt is 60 years of age, and he develops a very bad cold, and again he almost goes back and gives up the whole idea, but Elliot Gould persists, and they continue. And then in the end of August, they reach Blackfoot Crossing, the favorite site But Galt is intensely disappointed because the coal there is dirty, slow to ignite, and it crumbles once it's exposed to air. And the countryside around it is too dry. And so he has to reject coal banks. So instead, he now goes to Calgary and then south to coal banks. And here then, with the aid of Bryan and Stafford, they decide that this is the place that should be developed first. It's a very difficult decision to make because coal banks is still 110 miles away from the CPR main line. What it really needs is a railway. But Galt knows that at this point, the English backers are not going to finance a railway. In fact, the building of a railway is going to take a long time, and so instead he builds a steamboat. And I think we all know the story of the whole steamboat saga quite well. The point I just want to make is that it was always just a temporary measure, just to demonstrate to the world that coal banks coal was valuable and could be sold. During this whole period, Galt is working on building a railway. And finally, it's really towards the end of 1884 that he gets all the financing for the railway together, as well as the government subsidy. It's been a very trying time for Galt because the politicians changed their mind, the backers in England changed their mind, and so he writes, "I've had infinite worry about my railway, and now had to finally postpone it once again for a few months. We must get the act, that's in the Railway Act first. And it is also desirable to show by actual results that the coal can be got out for what it will be sold at." And so they decide to build yet another steamer. And so we have in that Christmas of 1883 a rather kind of a poignant scene. Galt is terribly homesick. He has left his wife and children in Montreal because he feels he can no longer afford to keep them in London. And so that Christmas of 1883, then he writes to his wife, "A dull room in a dull street, in a cool, moist day in London, gaslighted. An old man sitting in a faded armchair before the fire, wrapped in a warm dressing gown, a silk cap on his head, and his feet in slippers. On the table beside him, a testament and a photograph album and some newspapers." And then he goes on to say how he fingers through the photo album because these are the pictures of his wife and children. And so what Alexander Galt really wants to be is back in Montreal. Well, the shipping season of 1884, as you well know, is again a disaster. And with these two summer disasters in mind, Alexander Galt writes to his wife again, "The truth is my own position is such that I must endeavor before the new year to devise some mode of resolution, or I do not see how I can get on much longer. It seems a little hard to have to struggle against adverse fortune when one is getting old, but I should be very thankful that my energy and physical ability are not yet unequal to the strain, and I comfort myself with the belief that it must be all very wisely ordered." And so back in 1884 goes Galt again, once again to London. Smith, when he hears that Galt is coming back for more money, writes to a friend to Lethbridge, "He, Galt, is a good fellow, but I would as soon trust a dreaming, gushing young lady in business matters." That's the way Smith and Lethbridge view Galt. And Galt now has to use the services of a good friend, Colonel Zowski, one of the leading railway engineers in North America, to convince Smith. Well, actually, he goes to Burdette Coutts. He seems to have been the easiest. So first they convince him. The three men then go to Smith, convince Smith to back it, and then finally go to Lethbridge, and all of them gang up on Lethbridge. And someone has suggested maybe at this particular point they all decided that the new town that they're going to found should be called Lethbridge to make sure that Lethbridge was going to back the venture. After all, he could not let a town fail that was named after him. Well, this time then in the winter, just before Christmas of 1884, the whole package falls into place. And Galt writes his wife, "I cannot refrain from writing you again by the Oregon," the steamship then, "to tell you of my great thankfulness to God, that it has pleased him to bless my efforts here, and to relieve my mind from the great weight of anxiety with which I have looked forward to the future, not only on account of the dishonor which attaches to all those who are unable to meet their obligations, but also for the trouble and possible privation which I dreaded was impending over you and all I love." And so this now brings us then to the bustle of the activity of the 28th of February, 1885. On the far western fringes then of the prairies, a railway is being built. It's held up a bit by the Riel rebellions in March and April, but eventually it will be done. And on the 25th of August then of 1885, the first train rolls into Coalbanks. Now the road does not go into full operation until the 1st of September and will not be officially opened until the 24th. At 4 that afternoon on the 24th of September, a group of dignitaries, including the Governor General, the Marquis of Lansdowne, the Anglican Bishop of Saskatchewan, Reverend John McLean, and the General Superintendent of the CPR, J.M. Egan, arrive in Coalbanks, now officially renamed Lethbridge, by the train. They are welcomed by a large crowd of townsmen and miners. And after a short address by Galt, Governor General Lansdowne confidently declares that the Galt colliery and railway had solved the pressing energy problems for the Northwest Territories. In his speech, he expressed the exuberant hopes of all Westerners by boasting of the inexhaustible supply of the best class of fuel. And he'll boldly prophesy that from these cliffs we shall be able to draw without stint the materials which will supply us sources of heat and light for generations to come. And then in a sort of similar vein, Lansdowne grandly describes his vision of the future Lethbridge, a large industrial metropolis built on the coal mines, augmented by smelters and foundries, providing work for thousands of laborers. And after these grandiose predictions and prophecies, he officially opens the railway. Afterwards, the party then visited the inclined railway, which brought the coal up from the river banks to the railway terminal, and then they'll inspect the coal transferring facilities. And then in the evening, Galt hosts a giant banquet in the company boarding house, at which many speeches once again laud the Northwest Coal and Navigation Company's enterprise and the beneficial effects upon its surroundings. And so finally then, steel rails will tie Coalbanks or Lethbridge to the outside community, and the coal mining can begin. And so after a fairly long and arduous process, Lethbridge then is founded. Thanks.